My name is Caleb Denby, and welcome to the Endgame class. Today, I wanted to kind of continue my topic from the road to 2000. Once again, really the only chess tournament going on right now is this Magnus Carlsen Invitational that has some of the world's elite chess players squaring off online in some rapid chess. As luck would have it, thankfully they played some interesting endgames, and that's what I wanted to take a look at here today. Now, looking at my screen here, I have a game between Nepomniachtchi and Fabiano Caruana. Of course, two players in the candidates this year, perhaps getting some more practice before this latter half of the candidates resumes. Now, as you may have read in the title, this is an endgame class, which means I don't care about any of this garbage. I don't know what this is. This looks like chess, some opening. Oh, and it looks like a middle game now. We're getting closer. Some pieces are coming off the board. And wait, what's this? Wait a second, more trades? More trades? Wait, is it an endgame yet? I don't know. Wait, okay, now it's an endgame. Now it is an endgame. So this is the endgame I wanted to start off with. It's a little bit of an imbalanced endgame in more ways than one. So taking a look here at this position, obviously you can see who ended up winning the game, but who do you think is better to start with in this endgame and why? Of course, we just saw the moves Rook G1 from Fabiano Caruana, forcing more or less this queen for two rooks in balance. So in this case, what's better, the queen or the two rooks, and why? I believe it's around game in 20 with a little bit of a delay. I don't recall the exact time control, but somewhere around there. It's rapid chess. It's 15 plus 10, I'm being told. I trust Akarsh in the chat. I trust him. While you guys are thinking, Peter has a question for me. Achieved a rating of 1550 in the 8th grade, and then it looks like he lost interest in chess, but he's interested again 3 years later. What's your peak rating potential? Really just depends on people. If you're interested in chess again, everybody loves to improve, but the best way to do that is to really just keep playing chess, keep getting familiar with the game. And, I mean, obviously I won't say the sky's the limit, because you probably won't be a super grandmaster, but you can take the game really, really far, no matter when you start. So people are suggesting specific moves. Some people are saying the queen is better here because the king is vulnerable. If white can coordinate the rooks and get them to the 7th, then they would be better. The queen is better because white doesn't have the coordination yet. Queen, since the knight is a bit less safe. Okay, Akarsh is taking back his time control comment. I have no idea what the time control is. We're back to confusion. So in this case, the chat is actually pretty correct here. The queen is going to be the better piece in this endgame, largely because this white king lacks shelter. So if you ever find yourself in a situation, well, I guess in this case Rook G1 is more or less forced, in a situation where you have the opportunity to go in for an endgame with a queen against two rooks, the key pieces to look at are really going to be the kings. In this case, the black king is really safe, whereas the white king lacks shelter. And so that is one main reason why black is simply winning in this endgame. On top of that, the chat was also mentioning that the rooks lack coordination. That is the other key feature of queen versus double rook endgames. If the rooks can work together to either defend a lot of squares or attack a lot of squares, then of course, you know, the rooks are going to be better than the queen. Two pieces kind of just outrank one. In this case, though, the rooks don't really seem to be coordinated, and it's difficult to coordinate the rooks with this bishop taking away so many squares. In the game, Fabiano played the move queen e1 check. The king has to run to h2, and now simply queen f1 is a really annoying move just to lock this king kind of in prison on this h2 square and hit this rook as well. Now the move rook to c3 was played. And I wanted to ask you here to try and come up with a plan to really kill Nepomniachtchi here. Try and come up with a very distinct plan to kind of end this game. For the first endgame of tonight, I really gave you a good one because you're just totally winning out of the gate. It's all about finding out how to put the final nail in the coffin, though. I've been told it's a confirmed 15 plus 10 for the time control. Excellent. Well, safer is kind of a relative term, Jan. In the game, the king actually did not make it to h3, but even on h3, it's going to come under a lot of threats. At least one rook is going to have to be dedicated to this first rank to stop any queen h1 mating threats, and it's not going to be easy. Not going to be easy. Yes, the rooks are doing an excellent job of social distancing, but that's not always what you want when fighting a war. You want pieces working together. So, I mean, bishop e3 is a fine move, but probably the move rook g2 is... Okay, well, actually, hold on, I found the problem. Bishop e3 would be great, but I can take it. So, ha. I'm a Docs Gamer does, in fact, actually have the correct plan here. It's often the case in endgames like these where one king is weak, but one side kind of just lacks the material to get at the king. So in this case, it'd be great if our bishop could contribute to the attack, and maybe we could do some like crazy maneuver trying to get it to like b6 or something to help support the attack on g1. But in this case, it's much better to bring in more attackers. Now, I hear you screaming at home, but these are the only two pieces. Of course, the pawns can be useful attackers as well. And it's actually a really common plan in endgames like this, where one side does have the queen against the two rooks, to use the pawns both as kind of levers to open up more diagonals, more files, and as attackers themselves, to use the pawns themselves to control squares around the king, to make their own threats. So the plan that Gamer suggested here is, of course, bishop g5 as the first move. Rook g2 was played by white in the game, and now you simply play h5 as Fabiano did in the game, and you are really starting to break down the structure around the black, the white king. Sorry. Although I will say I messed up my order a bit. Fabi included the move rook queen e1, which attacks this rook d3, and then queen b1, rook c3. This doesn't really change the position at all, and then he continued with this nice move h5. G takes h5 was white's choice to try and keep the shelter around his king, but simply G takes h5 now. White threw in knight d2, hitting the queen. Of course, black isn't interested in trading off this bishop for this knight. This bishop is going to be used to help get at the white king, so queen d1 was Fabi's choice. And now after rook d3, Fabi takes the time to play king f8, stepping off of this file. And after rook f2, I'm sure you guys can find the winning move here. If you at home want to take a second to do it, you're welcome to try. Go ahead, pause the video. I'm just going to show it. The move is, of course, h4. You just break down the last defender in front of the white king, adding in another attacker with this h-pawn, and white is simply lost. G takes h4 was played, bishop takes h4, rook g2, and now simply king e7, and this king has a total lack of shelter. Rook b3 was played in the game, and you really see these rooks still not working together. Queen e1 comes on the board here. Knight c4 is white's try, and then I'll allow you guys at home one more move to try and find for yourselves black to move and pretty much either ensure checkmate or win significant material. So ensure checkmate or win significant material. See if you can do it. So Gerard is asking about the d2 square. I believe at most moments the bishop was guarding the d2 square. At most moments. What was Queen e1 threatening? Well, it was threatening this move, which I'm a Docs Gamer again has the correct answer along with Scott Mulligan, and that move is bishop g5. You bring the bishop to f4, and this is the checkmating pattern that Fabi found. In the game, Jan kind of relented and captured this free bishop, but of course now there's queen h4 check, and this rook gets picked up. And from here, now it is in fact just a very serious material edge for Fabi, and he won this game pretty easily. The knight and the rook aren't nearly good enough to stop the queen in this case. Queen c1 was played, the knight is attacked, knight e3 was tried, queen d2 is a check, king g3, and now king e6. Knight f5 was played, queen d1 hits the rook, and after some more maneuvering, queen g1 check, rook g2, queen e1. This queen just gets after this white king here, and in fact checkmates it on e6. And this is really the style you need to follow when playing with the queen. You just go after that king. If you can kill that king, you win the game. And that's really where the queen excels, where the rooks do not. The queen is a great attacker, especially in tandem with other pieces on the board. If you can break up the shelter around the opponent's king, that's when the queen is better than the two rooks in the end game. So it's an important note to keep in mind, and a really cool game by Fabi here, showing how the queen is a very, very dominant piece. Okay, with the easy one out of the way, let's move on to some more end games. And now I wanted to look at one that is technically a very, very equal end game, but because one player was Magnus Carlsen, somebody ended up winning the game. So why don't we take a look and see how this one went. Of course, it was Magnus against Hikaru. Nobody cares about this stage of the game. What we're interested in here is the end game. So in this case, White played a pretty interesting opening where he went for c5 early on, gaining some extra space, but Black played pretty solidly throughout the game and really is doing just totally fine here. In the game after knight a4, Hikaru Nakamura went for queen a6, taking off the last major pieces. Queen takes a6, knight takes a6. And now after knight d3, we have this simple two knights endgame. So, if you're Magnus Carlsen here, how do you think you should go about even trying to win this game? How can you even attempt to win a game that looks like this? I'm willing to take some ideas in the chat. How can you try to win a game like this? It's tough. It's honestly tough. It's especially tough because if you ask a computer, it's going to say you just don't win. That's how you win this game. You don't, because it's a draw. And computers only know how to speak the technical truths about chess rather than the practical considerations. So Jan has a very interesting suggestion. His suggestion is to play b5, which certainly creates imbalances. Just not so sure they're favorable. So the common thread here seems to be people want to play, it's Black's move. Black played f6 in the game, trying to keep an eye on the e5 square, but people want to try things like b5 and c6. Probably their opinion would change after the move f6, because now this pawn is simply going to hang. But b5 isn't a bad idea at all. Trying to create a passed pawn is a classic way to try to win the game. But f6 does kind of put a damper on those plans. Someone else, I believe, said try and target c6, which is a good idea. It's a little bit difficult to achieve. Someone else said a vague principle known as the principle of two weaknesses. You should try and create two weaknesses somewhere on the board to win the game. And that's actually kind of exactly right. In this case, we do have sort of a weakness on c6. It's tough to get at right now, but moves like c takes b6 and b5 are always going to be threats. And so we essentially have threats on the queen side of the board. So Black has to divert pieces to this side of the board a little bit. Now, on the king side, this is really where things aren't yet determined. And this is where Magnus started. He started by taking space on the king side. And by taking space, you do actually take on a little bit of risk. Of course, the farther up you push your pawns, the weaker they can become, the more susceptible to attack they can become. But once you take that extra space, if you manage to hold on to it, then your pawns are much closer to being very, very relevant, to creating more threats. Of course, simply because they're closer to queening. And so this is how Magnus Carlsen attempted to win this game. He starts with the move knight d2, black activates the king with king f7, and now the move f4 comes on the board. Magnus isn't really afraid to leave this pawn behind. He's going to expand with moves like g4, and he's going to take as much space as he possibly can on this side of the board to try and stretch the black pieces a little bit thin. In the game, knight c7 was Hikaru Nakamura's move, once again just trying to get his pieces back into the game. And now Magnus took the time to activate his king, king f2, knight b5, king f3 was played, and now this knight comes into c3. Magnus isn't really deterred by this knight though. This knight can't really get at anything important, and it's not going to create serious threats all by itself. So as stated, Magnus tries to take as much space as he can with g4. And now perhaps it doesn't change the evaluation of the position at all, but what it does do is give his opponent some more practical issues to figure out. And that's how endgames like these at the top level are won and lost. It's not always about the objective evaluation. It's about whose position is easier to play, which position can create problems for the opponent to have to solve. And Magnus is simply trying to give his opponent problems by taking this extra space on the king's side. In the game, Hikaru Nakamura went for g5. If you try and keep the pawn structure a little bit more symmetrical with a move like f5 rather, while you're running into things like c takes b6 and knight e5, already just kind of winning a pawn. So it's a little bit tough already for Hikaru Nakamura in this position. That's why g5 came on the board. And now after g5, Magnus in fact goes for this move f5. And here, perhaps psychology starts to play a little bit of a role. If you're black in this position, you're pretty sure you're the one trying to defend, trying to get a draw. And so black probably wasn't looking for too many opportunities here to try and take the advantage. If Hikaru had played the move e takes f5, it's kind of a classic case of Magnus perhaps over pushing, with this pawn being a little bit too far advanced and becoming weakness itself. So black to move here and solidify, kind of an advantage. Likely the position is still a draw, but black to move and really take the upper hand in this endgame. I'll let you at home try and find it here. I'll give you a hint. It's not some tactical line. It's in fact quite simple. And a quick question, if black ever takes with b takes c, there are a couple ways white could actually take back. In this case, both are pretty relevant here. It depends on the position, but in general, it does allow white to create more imbalances with d takes c5. This would be the practical way to play for more than a draw, playing d takes c5 with ideas of pushing b5 later. But no reason really to even allow this decision for white. Right now, the b pawn is okay. So someone in the chat has the correct answer. His name is in a very foreign language that I don't know how to read. The move is b5 here. And this is the move for black because it takes away white's threats on the queen side and frees up the knights to move a little bit more freely. Now, if white isn't careful, plays, for example, some kind of nonchalant move, let's say, I don't know how to even play a nonchalant move, like king g4 here. Well, now the move knight b8 is actually going to come on the board, and if white passes again, knight a6 is going to come on the board, and next thing you know, knight a2 is going to come on the board, and you're going to have some pretty serious issues on that side of the board. So the move b5 would have been the problem. However, in the game, black went for this move e5 instead, trying to play in the center a little bit, and now Magnus simply plays knight c1, stepping out of this e4 fork and not really taking on e5, when black would, in fact, be perhaps getting the upper hand of this trade here. You get a protected pass pawn, but black's pieces get really, really active. So knight c1 instead. Now if you try the move b5, it doesn't really come with quite the same effect here, because white is simply a little bit faster at attacking this c6 pawn. So in the game, After knight c1, e4 check was played, king f2, and black brought this king over to e7. Now, how do you want to organize your pieces if you are Magnus Carlsen here? How can you go about continuing to make annoying threats for your opponent? What can you do? I've been told the very foreign language is Greek in the chat. So where do you want to stick the pieces to give Hikaru Nakamura some trouble here? Remember that principle of two weakness, this idea stretching the black pieces thin, creating threats on both sides of the board. King g3 and h4. Not quite. Not quite in this case. h4 doesn't really get you anything. Let's say black just passes, even if you play h4 here and pass, h takes g5, h takes g5, at the very least for black. Black may have had better in that sequence, but you don't really change anything. You just trade pawns with this idea. So, okay, I'm getting some vague specific one-move responses here from the chat. Let me phrase it a different way. Which square do you want your first knight on? Which square do you want your second knight on? And which square do you want the king on? And which order do you kind of want to do these things in? So Michael has a plan for this knight. Michael wants to bring this knight to f1, and then to g3, and then to h5. What are we doing with this other knight? I quite like this plan for knight number 1 here, this knight on d2. But what are we doing with knight number 2? Knight on c1. Where does this guy go? And yeah, the b3 square has been suggested. And I think this is really the best square that this knight can hope for. It is creating some threats on the queen side. If black ever dares to play b5, then it can step into a5 in one turn and attack this c6 pawn. So that's where I want my two knights. And as for the king, where are we putting the king? D2 has been suggested, and I think that's a perfectly fine square for this king. You want it centralized so it can impact this queen side, which seems a little bit more fluid right now, as well as come back to the king side if need be, or even up the board in some crazy line that might never happen. So Magnus does exactly that. He wants threats on both sides of the board. So he wants the knight to be able to come here, and he wants the knight to be able to come here. Threats on both sides to stretch the black pieces thin. So, knight f1 was played. It's a perfectly good move. Now knight a4 from Hikaru. Now I should say, the evaluation of the position has not changed. It's still a dead draw. But Magnus is still somehow pressing, just by giving his opponent the opportunity to slip up, creating problems for his opponent. Now king e2 came on the board, bringing the king into the center. Knight b2 from Hikaru, he's shuffling a little bit. We have king d2, and now knight c4 check. Hikaru plants the knight on this square, trying to create threats against e3. King c3 was played, and now knight b8 comes on the board from Hikaru, and now knight b3 gets played. And black to move here and secure the draw. Pretty much just totally secure the draw. Black to move. See if you can find how Hikaru could have more or less ended this game. Now, I say more or less just ended the game. Magnus, of course, still probably would have kept pressing, would have kept trying, as Magnus does. I'm too impatient to wait for the chat delay to catch up on this one. I'm sure people have it. The idea I'm talking about is actually just going to be the move b5. b5 really does lock down the position a little bit more by not allowing white to have this idea with c takes b6, and yeah, the chat is caught up, and they also suggest b5. By not allowing c takes b6, you really limit white's opportunities here. You can still play moves like knight a5, but now the move king d7 is going to be black's response, and this knight has a little bit of freedom to defend the weakness on the king side, while the king defends the weakness on the queen side. The play could continue. For example, you can't play knight g3 because of this e3 pawn. So what do you really do? Maybe you try to bring the knight over, but now knight a6. The king over, but then knight a6. If you draw this queen back, well, still knight a6 is going to come. And where are you going with this knight? If you go this way, the king will step over. And there's just no real way for white to break through. He has too many weaknesses of his own to go pawn hunting like this. So b5 would have been the move for Hikaru Nakamura. Instead, knight a6 was played, and it is still a dead draw. But now Magnus takes on b6. We see knight takes b6, and now knight a5. And things are just a little bit more fluid here. This pawn, of course, is under pressure, so king d7 was played. But now knight g3, and we see weakness number 1 and weakness number 2. Magnus is starting to converge, starting to create these problems once again. King c7 was Hikaru's choice, clearing off this d7 square. Now knight h5, knight d7. It looks like everything's under control for the moment. But now, simply knight b3. And Magnus, once again, is just bringing this piece around to help somewhere else on the board. And now was finally the mistake for Hikaru Nakamura. So I won't ask you to find the draw for black here. Instead, I will ask you to try and find the win for white after the move king d8. How does white win the game? One slip up from Hikaru was all it takes. And now, black is simply busted. Black is busted. White to move and win the game. Letting the chat catch up on this one, because this one's important. This one is critical, as they say. So, Imadox Gamer does in fact have the correct first move. The correct first move, of course, is the move knight to c5. Not knight a5. Knight a5 simply kind of repeats, I think, after king c7. Remember, this knight just actually came from a5. We came back and black played king d8. The move knight c5 is in fact the idea. And the problem for black now is if you dare to take this knight off the board, we're going to play b takes c5, not d takes c5. And the king is starting to invade. This knight can no longer really get to the e3 square unless it goes really journeying, which is just never going to happen. And this king is quite close to invading on the queen side. And because this king is kind of locked defending against the other king here, that's what gives this knight a little bit more freedom to come around and wreak some havoc on these pawns. He's got 3 weaknesses to attack. It's not going to be so easy for the black knight to defend all of them. And so Magnus would simply be winning if knight takes c5. In the game, he played knight b8, which is a perfectly fine move. But now, the really killer move from Magnus Carlsen is this move, b5. Of course, these endgames are all about getting your king into the game, and b5 gives Magnus Carlsen the path into the game that he needed. C takes b5, played in the game, and now king b4. And this is the reason why Magnus ends up winning this game. He used this extra space to get his king active. He used the weaknesses on opposite sides of the board to stretch the black pieces a little bit thin. And then he struck when the iron was hot, played b5, got his king in the game. Knight c6 check, king takes b5, knight a7 check, king a6. This king has invaded. Now, rather than kind of sit back and allow death to come for him, Hikaru tried trading off one pair of knights. Magnus actually took on a7 rather than taking on c5, and perhaps this was a little bit of a mistake here. Taking on c5 would have been a much clearer win. With this passed pawn, the move d4 is really not a threat. This knight can very easily come back to catch the e-pawn. But king takes a7 instead, and now the game kind of continues. The move knight d3 could have been tried for Hikaru, giving up this f6 pawn, instead going for a really crazy knight f4 sacrifice to get to h3, when this move would actually end up losing the game. Not to g takes f4, but instead to e3, when the knight cannot catch the pawn. But, you know, that was a little bit wild, and, you know, white is still holding a comfortable advantage here just by bringing the king over, I believe. So that was kind of missed, but that's one of those types of tactics that's just really kind of impossible to find, especially in a rapid game. Maybe he comes up with this in a classical game, but I'd be very, very impressed. The principle of the endgame that I want you to walk away with is getting the king active using this principle of two weaknesses. So in the game, Hikaru simply plays the move knight b3, and now after king b6, king d7, this move knight takes f6 check comes on the board, and all of the black pawns kind of collapse. Hikaru tried this knight sacrifice, but after e takes d4 resigned when he realized that after the move e3, the white knight is in fact catching up to this pawn, taking advantage of the king's placement. The move knight e6 or knight a6 would both win, when after e2, there is knight c5 check and knight d3, stopping this pawn and winning the game. So that is how Magnus Carlsen ended up winning this endgame, which likely should have been a draw. By all rights, objectively was a draw, but practically Magnus Carlsen found chances and executed when his opponent finally slipped up. So the key points I want you to take away from this endgame are, first of all, way back near the start of the endgame here, we see Magnus go for this idea with f4, g4, and f5. Taking extra space in the endgame is a really great way to create more threats on the other side of the board. So threats on both sides of the board, and he did so by taking extra space. From there, he kind of separated his pieces a little bit, sending one knight to attack on the king's side, the other to attack on the queen's side, and the king to kind of float around, defend some weaknesses, and step into the queen's side if necessary. So creating threats on both sides of the board. And then from there, the really nice finish by Magnus was really this idea of knight c5 with b5 to follow. The final way to break through into the position is by giving your king an avenue to invade. And once the king invaded, white was simply winning. All right. So that's all I have for that game. On to the third endgame of the night. This is one between Maxime Vachier-Lagrave and Anish Giri in their match in the Invitational. Once again, I don't care about the opening. I don't care about the middle game. I don't care about all these tactics. All I care about is when we finally arrive at the end game, which we are officially in here. So this is what I'm calling the start of the very interesting end game played between MVL and Anish Giri. Now, once again, you can probably see the result on your screen, but I want to ask you who is better here and why. And once you say white, because of course you're going to say white is better, I want to understand how with white do you really get this advantage? How do you get this advantage? Why do I only show Giri's games when he's losing? He just loses in interesting ways. It's kind of a compliment, actually, to be able to play chess so well that your opponents have to play pretty brilliant games to win. So, why is white better here? Thank you for watching, King Lear. Why is white better in this endgame? White can make a passed pawn easily, but the bishops are of opposite colors. So that is why white is better. And you're saying black has good drawing chances because these bishops are on opposite colors. However, as we'll see in the game, it actually ends up being quite difficult for black. So it is true, white is better here because he can easily make a passed pawn. So I want to ask you guys, after the moves rook d8 and bishop a4, the move rook d5 was played. And I guess you can kind of find this move because it's forced, but of course the best move for white here is to create a passed pawn with the move e6. This is the move that gives white a very significant advantage. With e6, black more or less has to take this pawn, and after rook takes e6, this f pawn is now a passed pawn, whereas black has to work quite hard to create a passed pawn on the queen side of the board, whereas white already has this pawn on f2. Now I want to mention, if this pawn, and let's say after rook e5, if this pawn were on h2, then this game would absolutely just be a dead draw. But this pawn is on f2, making it a passed pawn and giving white quite significant chances. Now, if you find yourself in an endgame of bishops of opposite colors, if there are rooks on the board, your winning chances are greatly increased. Having the rooks on the board allows you to make extra threats, allows you to make threats against the king, and allows you to attack squares of both colors, for one. So, of course, white does not trade the rooks here. White wants to keep the winning chances alive, and so white plays the move rook d6. Now, bishop c5 came on the board for black. Rook d2 by white, guarding the second rank for a moment, preparing to organize the pieces. King g7. And now I want to ask you, what's the winning plan here for white? How do you give your opponent problems that are difficult to solve in this position? It's a little bit easier to come up with a winning plan in this position than the last position, because white does actually have an advantage here. Whereas in the previous position, I would argue it's just dead equal. Also, higher rating. That is another advantage that is often overlooked in chess. So what's the winning plan here for white? All right, while the chat is answering, I'm just going to give you guys the answer because they won't hear me for another 30 seconds. Okay, Harshal Khanna does in fact have the winning plan. In the immortal words of Yasser Seirawan, push him, baby. All right, you got to push him. So this is how white is going to make threats for black in this position. Simply pushing this f-pawn up the board in tandem with the g-pawn in order to give black serious problems. If black can't stop these pawns, well, then he's going to lose the game. So for black, obviously the goal should be to get active counterplay in order to prevent these pawns. Now, with bishops of opposite colors, let's say, for example, somehow the rooks got traded. Let's say white was a little bit worse at chess than MVL, and the rooks got traded. Well, if that happens, then black can really kind of just take a passive approach here by guarding the dark squares. A move like h6, a move like bishop e7, and guess what? You're never going to be able to play the move g5, and as such, you're never going to be able to play the move f6. And that's kind of just a perfectly easy draw for black to set up here. Passively defending, blockading the pawns. However, with rooks on the board, it is not nearly so simple. With rooks on the board, if you try to go for something similar, let's say, king g2, king here, let's say white passes for a few turns, allowing you to get this set up, b3. It's true that you can kind of try and set up a fortress here where you are, defending all your stuff, and trying to create a strong point on this g5 square. You're still going to run into problems with moves like f4. Now this rook has to move out of the way. And already, with this rook in the game, you'll see that these pieces get shaken loose quite easily. Especially with a rook and a bishop, it's enough material to make significant threats against the king. So with these rooks on the board, this is why white has extra winning chances. This passive type of blockade simply isn't going to be enough for black, which means black has to be a little bit more creative, has to go for some activity rather than passive blockading. I know I took a while to get to the point there, but hopefully that makes some sense. So b6, bishop b3 for white. This was actually the game position now. Black does play h6. It's still useful to try and guard the g5 square. It's just not the only thing you can do. Now f4 comes on the board. Very natural play from white, hitting this rook. Rook e3, rook d7 check, rook e7, rook d8. And now black starts kind of wasting some time here. And like I said, passive defense is not really going to be enough for black. He starts playing moves like bishop b4, which, I mean, it's a fine move, but it's not really what we want here, you know. And we'll see in the game, this bishop comes to e1, and then back to c3, and then back to f6, kind of just wasting a ton of time. So instead of that, I'd like you guys at home to come up with an active plan for black to get closer to attaining a draw. You want to find something active to do. So let's see if you can, at home, come up with an active way to give white some speed bumps on his pathway to pushing these pawns. What can you do with black to just harass white a little bit? Slow down these pawns on the king side. So Brian says at least try something on the queen side, and that's not a bad idea at all. So how should you go about trying things on the queen side? Well, it turns out the best way to do it is actually just to leave this pawn on b6 and start pushing this guy up the board. This is one way to kind of give white some real problems. So the best line I could come up with also involves getting this rook active. This was kind of the first thing I wanted to do when I saw this position. Yes, having the rook on the e-file is important because we need to guard against these checks, but having this rook on a slightly more active square can also come in handy. Now, for example, let's say white plays a move like rook c8 or something. Now, I wanted to get the queenside pawns rolling, as Brian had suggested here. You want to try and create some threats on the other side of the board. Make it so that white can't just totally commit all of his pieces to the king side. Now, king h3 would be a very natural move for white. Of course, a4 is slightly a threat here with the idea of rook e2 check. So king h3, for example. And now, why not play a move like rook e4, rather? I was going to say bishop e7, but I think rook e4 is a bit better. Once again, just actively giving white problems in his quest to push these pawns. Of course, white doesn't really want to play the move f5. This does allow black to set up a more permanent blockade with sticking this king someplace annoying, like g5, for example. So g4 then would also be tough due to rook takes f4. So rook e4, momentarily giving white some problems. Let's say king g4 gets played. You know, white still comes up the board. Well, now these moves like a4 are already really getting quite close to just an absolute draw. If this bishop moves to c2, for example, well, now rook e2, and this pawn becomes very, very difficult to defend. If a move like bishop d5, for example, well, now rook d4, let's say bishop c6, simply rook d2, and once again, this pawn gets difficult to defend. And if you really try to hold on to this bishop with like bishop f5, even king f6 now. And we're getting quite creative, but we are getting this bishop off the board somehow. So the whole point of this is by pushing this a pawn down the board, you create threats on the queen side. You create threats to trade off the a pawns, giving black this passed pawn. And by trading pawns, you get yourself a lot closer to a drawn endgame where you're willing to sacrifice the bishop for white's final remaining pawns. So this, I believe, is how Anish Giri should have gone about trying to draw this game. Active play, playing with the rook, getting activity, and looking to fight back on the queen side. Instead, what we got from Anish Giri was this series of bishop moves that just kind of left me unimpressed. Bishop e1, simply g4, bishop c3, rook d6 now, bishop back to f6, trying to passively blockade, but against the rook, it's not good enough. Bishop e6 comes on the board for Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. Now, simply rook c7, but the king starts to advance with king e4. This bishop drops back, and now rook d3. Once again, MVL going to avoid the rook trade at all crossroads here. No reason to take the rooks off the board. It makes black's defense that much easier. Now it's probably still not too late for black to end up drawing this game, but you really do have to start going for things like b5 now. You have to start playing on this queen side. Instead, Anish Giri goes for king f6, hitting this bishop, bishop back to b3, and now b5 does come on the board. And it's nice. It's a nice idea, but the black pieces are in much worse position than they were quite a few moves ago when I was suggesting moves like a5 and a4. So now b5, MVL comes up with the move rook d5, and this rook is attacking this pawn quite nicely. Rook c5, once again, MVL not looking to trade rooks, gets rook d7, and we are starting to see some of the problems for black here. It's tough to hold all of these pieces together, and in the meantime, keep a constant watchful eye on the move g5. So for the moment, everything is together, so black plays the move a5. Now the move rook a7 for MVL is starting to threaten this pawn, a4, but now bishop d5. And the king in the center is totally safe from all checks thanks to this bishop. This rank defense is being interfered with, so g5 might become threatening very, very soon. And the black king is not totally safe on f6 either. Checks could always come, and these queenside pawns have actually been quite weakened by this push, rather than becoming active. Rook c1 comes on the board, but now rook a6 check, king back to g7, and king f5. And the end is kind of near for black, if I'm 100% honest. White has invaded quite far with this king, and g5 is going to come on the board eventually, or even just simply f5. Rook c7 was black's trying to defend the 7th rank, but now rook a5, rook back to c5, king e6, bishop d8 hits the rook a8, bishop up to h4, and Anish Giri just kind of passing the time now. Rook a7 is a check, king over to f8, and now after rook h7, finally pawns begin to fall. And this is the problem here. With these extra pawns, white is able to slowly work his way up the board with his pieces, create threats around the black king, and that's how exactly you should play when you have a rook and a bishop against a rook and a bishop of the other color. You need to keep the rooks on the board to create threats against the opponent pieces, and use that to advance up the board and attack their weaknesses. And now this game is quite simply dead lost for Anish Giri. He missed his chance to get active, to play on the queen side, and now it's all over. So, bishop g3 was played in the game. This does allow f5 now, and if you play a move like bishop f4 trying to hold on, well, you're going to get met with f6 and, checkmate. Checkmate. It hurts a little bit. So, can't be played. Rook c7 instead. Now white picks up the free pawn, and connected passed pawns are going to be enough here. MVL is now happy to trade off the rooks because connected passed pawns against bishops of opposite colors are in fact still a win. So bishop c6 even picks up black's remaining pawn on the queen side, and here Anish Giri just resigned this game. Okay, so this was another interesting endgame from the Magnus Carlsen Invitational once again. And the points to take away from this are when you end up in an endgame with bishops of opposite color like this, but rooks are on the board, it's not going to be the simple, easy draw that you might have been led to believe when you hear people talking about bishops of opposite colors. Rooks on the board allow you to make threats against the enemy king, allow you to make threats against even the bishop itself can become a target, as well as threats against the remaining pawns on the board. And it gives you a lot more flexibility to work with your pieces. And as MVL did in this game, the way to work with it is to push your pieces up the board, keep threats against the enemy king, and use your extra passed pawn to your advantage, as MVL did in this game. Okay, I have just one more endgame for you guys before we get out of here. This is, of course, the endgame between Fabiano Caruana and Ding Liren. Fabi, I believe, barely won the match against Ding. There was some back and forth in this one, and Fabi ended up winning in Armageddon. But this is one of the games that Fabi ended up winning. Once again, this is the endgame class. What are we doing here? There's too many pieces on the board. I'm so confused. Get these pieces. Please start trading. I don't understand anything. Oh my gosh, so many pieces on the board. So complicated. This isn't an endgame. Wait a second. Hold on. Takes. C5. Takes f4. Okay, I think we did it, guys. I'm calling this finally an endgame. And of course, this is an endgame originating from a Ruy Lopez Berlin. So, what is going on in this position? What do you guys think? Who has the advantage objectively and who has the advantage practically, and is the answer the same to both of those? Is the answer is just a draw? Tell me what you think here. Tell me what you think. There are some imbalances in the position, so saying it's a simple draw might be a little bit misleading. This is an endgame. I'm willing to call this an endgame. There's a few different definitions of what an endgame is. A very popular one is the endgame kind of starts when the kings start being able to contribute to the position. When the kings can get active themselves and start playing without having to worry quite as much about the threat of checkmate, that's when the endgame can kind of begin. No, it's not a perfect definition. Of course, in a lot of major piece endgames, the king still comes under fire, but it's one that kind of fits here. The kings can start contributing. So yeah, I like white here, and the reason I like white is in fact because of the better minor piece, as well as slightly more active rooks in this case. Now, if you ask a computer, the computer's going to say it's a dead draw, and probably it is with perfect play. But practically, black is the one with more problems to solve. He does have a pretty active bishop on d4, but the fact is it's locked on the same color as all these pawns, and this pawn on c7 in particular may become a bit of a weakness that black has to keep track of. In the meantime, white has a similar weakness on c2, but the difference is this bishop can never attack that square. So only rooks are going to be able to hit this weakness on c2, whereas the white knight could potentially get at the c7 pawn. The other advantage, as I said, is the advantage in activity. This rook is a little bit more active than black's pieces, and so black is perhaps a little bit worse in terms of activity. Now, there are a couple things you can do here with black. The computer actually wants to just play the move rook e8, but the problem is, of course, white can now really take off this h5 pawn. This h5 pawn's indefensible. For example, an example line is king g7, rook takes h5, king g6, rook h4, and now rook e2. And so white gives away the c pawn in exchange for this h pawn. And with this imbalance, white once again might have some more practical chances with the passed h pawn being so far up the board, but he's also going to have a lot of weaknesses that he has to keep track of as well on the queen side. So perhaps that was best play. In the game, Liren very naturally just plays the move king h7, the idea being now you can't really win this h pawn. Fabi plays very simply as well. You simply bring the king into play, king g2 to f3. Now this king is doing a great defensive job from f3, stopping the rook from invading on the e2 square. It's a great way to play against the rooks, just take away their invading squares. And it's also quite safe on f3. This pawn guards these two checking squares. These two files are more or less going to stay closed, and so you can't really get at this king, especially with this f pawn here. That being said, f5 comes on the board. Black is trying to push this pawn up the board, make that king feel a little bit less comfortable, but perhaps this move was a bit of a mistake, because now white can actually get the advantage. We're running out of time here, so I'm not going to ask you guys to find it. The best move here for white is what was played in the game. Simply knight e3 is highlighting that this pawn is a little bit weak, just a little bit weak. In the game, bishop g7 was played, and now if you play a move like knight takes f5, the problem is bishop e5 comes on the board. If you play a move like rook takes f5, well, rook takes e3 is an even simpler tactic. So you can't take this pawn just yet, but what you can do is the move that Fabiano played in the game, the very nice move, rook g1. Now, if black plays a little bit nonchalantly here with something like rook e7, well, the move rook g5 is going to come, and the rooks are really killing together. If you play a move like king h6, highlighting that, or trying to play against this, now knight takes f5 comes with check. Lastly, if you play a move like bishop h6, trying to solve all your problems, well, now after rook h4, you can't play king h6. And so the fact is, tactically, black is just losing a pawn here. So that is the first part of this endgame I wanted to look at. Does that make sense to everybody? So white has a slight advantage in activity, so black has to be pretty careful here. f5 was not careful enough, and after some accurate play, white ends up winning this pawn by force. Now this is the part of the endgame that's going to be kind of difficult to replicate in your own games. It just involves calculating and seeing these kinds of threats. The second part of the endgame I wanted to talk about is what happens now after bishop h6, rook h4, and f4 is played, how Fabi ends up converting up the pawn. So right now h5 and c7 are both hanging. Rook e5 hangs onto the h5 pawn, but knight takes c7 now is the extra pawn for Fabiano. Rook f6 comes on the board now, and Fabi ends up playing this move c3. So of course, with the extra pawn, in order to really make it felt in the position, you need to create a passed pawn, and that's exactly what Fabi is trying to do here. So in the game, rook g6 was played, allowing rook d1. Now, rook c6 is met with knight b5, king g6, and after d4, we end up with this passed pawn for Fabi. However, things get a little bit more complicated than that. Like a young I'll take young Jan Gustafsson. Also, it's a very difficult sentence to say. So after this, some tricky tactics actually come on the board, and perhaps Fabi ends up in a little bit of trouble. Rook takes b5 is Ding Liren's choice. A takes b5, and now if black had found the move rook f6, it would have been a really, really interesting game. Bishop g5 is going to be black's next move, just simply picking up this rook on h4. In exchange, white would get to push this pawn really far up the board. But this was unfortunately missed in the game after rook to c3 check was played, simply king e4, now bishop g5, rook g1 comes on the board, king h6, and now rook takes f4, bishop takes f4, king takes f4 is played. So, some complicated tactics there. Ended up going Ding Liren's way until Ding Liren missed the nice idea of rook f6. And this is the last part of the endgame I wanted to talk about here, this pure rook endgame. So, you can probably see the result on your screen, but this one is more simple than the other endgames tonight. How do you win this with white, and how do you try to draw with black? What do you think? What do you think? What do you do to go for a draw here with black? And how do you crush your opponent's hopes of ever drawing the position with white? Hello to Chess Space Arabia. Thank you for tuning in. Just waiting on the chat to catch up. See what they think. See what they think here. So, okay, black to move here. Black played rook takes b3. So I'll give you the position with white to move as well. So, okay, you guys kind of have the right idea here. The way white wins this game is using this d pawn. And so, the one kind of misstep I wanted you guys to avoid was trying to go after more pawns in the black camp. Trying to be fancy, playing moves like, I don't know, even like rook g5, trying to just get this rook even more active and take off some more black pawns. This is definitely not the way to win this position. Now, rook g5 might not be the first move that comes to mind for you guys, but I've seen this in a lot of games where players with this extra passed pawn, they'll get kind of caught up in the specifics of the position. You know, they'll be afraid to give away their other pawns, when in fact, in a position like this, the easy winning idea is to simply push the pawn to victory. So a move like rook g5 is really giving away a lot, because now if black's smart, black will start pushing the a pawn. And this is really just going to end up in a draw now. For example, if you play a move like rook d5, really going after this pawn, black's just going to ignore you. a3 directly. Rook d6 is a check, king g7, rook takes b6. We can pick off this h3 pawn now if we want. And while you've been busy pushing all these pawns, taking all these pawns, black has pushed his relevant passed pawns. And suddenly, the game is a lot more complex than it used to be, and by no means is this winning for white. So that's the misstep I wanted to talk about in this endgame. That's the reason I kind of wanted to show it, is after a move like rook takes b3, you really just don't want to get caught up in defending your own pawns and going after more pawns. The key to winning this position is to play moves like d5. You just push the d pawn, and then the black rook is going to have to sacrifice itself, and the game is going to end. Now, you might have heard the saying, rooks belong behind passed pawns, but rook d3 here isn't going to be good enough due to the cut off king, so Fabi would just push in this manner. So rook takes b5 was not played in the game, actually. a4 was played in the game, but now rook d1, and this is just going to be dead. We see this pawn pushed directly to victory. Note, Fabi takes no time to deal with anything else. He just pushes this pawn, and after rook d3, Ding Liren ends up resigning. And that is the way to win this endgame. Okay, that is all I've had for you guys tonight in the endgame class. Thank you very much for joining me here once again for more games from the Magnus Carlsen Invitational Tournament going on right now. If you're watching live, be sure to head over to our Twitch channel, where we will actually be continuing the fun with the Analyze Your Games class. If you're watching the video, then this is it. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week.